Thank you all for taking some time to listen to my presentation about the Brigham Young Monument and settler colonialism. Before proceeding, I would like to acknowledge that I am delivering this paper from the traditional lands of the Squally Opsh, more commonly known as the Nisqually Indian tribe, in Olympia, Washington, in the United States. As I've learned about this people and their relationship to the land dating back thousands of years, I mourn their subjugation and am working to support their tribal sovereignty and treaty rights and to educate myself and others about doing so as well. Thank you. In this presentation, I want to offer a reading of the Brigham Young Monument in downtown Salt Lake City, Utah, that shows how it embodies and tries to justify, on a semiotic level, settler colonial violence against indigenous bodies and, by extension, their communities and lands. This understanding of the monument came to me several years ago when my family and I visited my parents around Christmas time after they had moved up from Southern California to the Salt Lake area. While I had seen the monument frequently beforehand, I had never really noticed that it presents the figure of a Native American man beneath the figure of Brigham Young, the so-called vanquished, literally underfoot. While I could not clearly articulate it at first, being kind of new to understanding colonialism, I've come to understand it as an embodiment of ongoing settler-colonial relationships between the United States and indigenous peoples, but also between the church as an institution and native bodies, communities, and lands. Before diving into analysis, let's do a quick tour of the memorial. It is topped by a 10-foot tall bronze figure of Brigham Young facing east. This very boxy figure presents an image of strength, stability, and power. His pose is important. With his weight shifted back onto his right leg and a cane in his right hand, his left foot extended slightly, it communicates a kind of dynamic stability, a stability with purpose and drive, a journey not quite finished. His extended left hand is a curious gesture, with the palm facing the sky. It could be read as a gesture of welcome or a gesture of generosity. Beneath the figure of Brigham Young sits an 8-foot tall Native American man facing east, his extended right hand holding a bow, his neck adorned with cultural and possibly sacred symbols. Though it can't be seen from this angle, the figure wears a quiver of arrows on its back. His face holds a rather typical stoic Indian expression that has been part of the iconography of the vanishing race myth, a cultural narrative that declares that the indigenous peoples of North America are extinct or will vanish sometime in the future. A myth that Dunbar Ortiz and Giulio Whitaker call the most pervasive, pernicious, and self-serving when it comes to explaining colonial violence in the North American context. On the base facing west sits an 8-foot tall figure of a fur trapper, the kind that was common in the pre-settlement homelands of the Ute, Shoshone, Paiute, and other tribes of the region. Historically, of course, trappers and other frontier traders presaged the coming settlement and destruction of indigenous homelands throughout North America, and they themselves often had very ambivalent relationships with native peoples, sometimes peaceful, other times fractious and violent. Note the musket across his lap. Additionally, on the figure's left hip is a hunting knife. On the south side is a bronze relief of a Mormon pioneer settler, standing in front of his covered wagon, while to his right his dog sits on its hind legs looking up at him, and his wife is hunched over a pot. To his left sits his daughter, apparently playing or gathering. In Western art, dogs are used iconographically to signify loyalty, and its presence in this image suggests that the pioneer is true to the vision laid out by Young and other church leaders. In his left hand he holds a musket. I've altered the color on this detail to hopefully make it a bit clearer. Significantly, like the figure of Young atop the pedestal, the settler faces roughly east, and his weight is shifted back on his right leg while his left leg is bent, suggesting that he is also not yet at journey's end, and he is ready to keep moving, to keep following the vision of his leader. Below this relief, a plaque reads, "In honor of Brigham Young and the pioneers." On the north side of the base is a plaque with the names of the advance party, including 3 slaves, and also a partial list of equipment they brought with them. One piece of equipment was a cannon, which we'll come back to in a bit. This monument was commissioned in 1891 as part of the push by Mormon and non-Mormons in the territory for statehood, and was designed by Cyrus Dallin. The figure of Brigham Young was included in the Utah exhibition at the 1893 Chicago-Columbia Exposition, which was considered an important part of the statehood campaign. The monument had 2 unveilings in Salt Lake City, an intermediate configuration in 1897 and then in 1900 when it was completed. For both unveiling ceremonies, the figures were draped with American flags and patriotic music was played by military bands. At this point, let's take a brief look at settler colonialism. Before moving on, let me first acknowledge that settler colonialism is not a singular concept. It might be best to acknowledge that there are a number of settler colonialisms. Different geographical contexts yield different colonized-colonizer relationships, though there will be similarities. In this presentation, I'll be looking specifically at westward expansion in the American context. I've included this well-known American painting to visualize important aspects of this set of colonized-colonizer relationships. The painting, entitled American Progress, dates from 1872 and was created by John Gast. It visualizes a number of aspects of important threads in American settler colonial mythology, which holds that white Christian settlers had a God-given mandate to push west across the continent and to take and occupy land, as well as spread Christianity along with Western learning, politics, economics, technology, etc. By the 1870s, however, the American westward expansion had very little need for benevolence towards indigenous peoples and became focused on clearing native bodies and communities from the land. This was a time of very intense and widespread anti-indigenous violence. In more traditional forms of colonialism, colonizers had a vested interest in preserving indigenous populations and their traditional lands to some degree because they needed indigenous peoples to serve as cheap labor as a cheap labor force, or in the case of more recent forms of economic and cultural colonialism, as a reliable customer base. Settler colonialism, on the other hand, has no real interest in keeping native peoples alive because, in the words of Patrick Wolfe, it operates on a logic of elimination, with the goal of eliminating native peoples to the greatest extent possible, by destroying their bodies and societies and taking over their lands to build an entirely new social world. Land in this colonial form is of utmost importance because it becomes the primary form of capital and resource base. Furthermore, the logic of elimination has 2 modalities, either elimination through physical violence, through death, war, etc., or elimination through the absorption and assimilation of native peoples into the dominant colonial culture. The modalities, of course, are not mutually exclusive, as the boarding school programs in North America and other re-education efforts in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, proved. Wolfe's seminal study starts with the unsettling line, "The question of genocide is never far from discussions of settler colonialism." To enter into Mormon settler colonialism, I'd like to refer to Elise Boxer's essay in Colvin and Brooks's 2017 collection, Decolonizing Mormonism. Boxer offers an indigenous reading of the This Is the Place monument and its surrounding park. She acknowledged that a critical component of Mormon settler colonialism was not the elimination of indigenous peoples through physical violence, but of acquiring their territories, which did actually involve plenty in anti-indigenous physical violence, unfortunately. In the memorial park, quote, "indigenous peoples are scarcely included," end quote. She noted, except for a brief acknowledgement in the monument's plaque and a Native American village, tucked way in the back that presents indigenous peoples as some kind of relic from a past age. Her analysis calls attention to patterns of colonial erasure of natives rather than the outright violence that comes with erasure, or that presages erasure. Further, she connects the erasure of indigenous peoples to her own experience as both Dakota and Mormon, a faith community in which she felt, quote, as though she never fully belonged, end quote, and whose sacred text, the Book of Mormon, distinguishes between white and delightsome righteous Nephites and dark and loathsome Lamanites who became identified with indigenous North Americans. While not quite unique to Mormonism, she noted that the white, dark religious rhetoric that Mormons brought with them drove the arrival of settlers who extinguished indigenous relationships with the land, and is still at play in the organization of the monument space and in the personal experiences of many indigenous Mormons. If the This Is the Place monument is a monument to erasure of indigenous peoples, then the Brigham Young Monument, just 5 miles away, is more of a memorialization to the violence inherent in settler-colonial relationships. I would like to suggest that this is the case because the monument can be read as having a familial relationship with Civil War memorials that were built from the end of the 19th century through the early 20th century. The similarities come both from context and purpose of the memorial and through what I call generic stylistic elements. Though I don't have time to go into the argument, I would like to acknowledge that I'm relying on a reading strategy suggested by Gil Absinoga and David Machen in their paper Analyzing the Language of War Monuments, in which they write about British World War I memorials. The primary points of analysis they look at are context and purpose, style and design, materials and form in war memorials. One point they made bears repeating, though. All art objects, especially public art objects, materially, quote, communicate discourses or motivated versions of events comprising kinds of identities, values, and assessments of events, end quote. Furthermore, monuments and memorials present, quote, selective historical narratives, end quote, that political and cultural elites find most useful and comfortable, according to Bellatani and Ponzio. Bashir, in writing about several Civil War monuments built in North Carolina between 1885 and 1915, discussed the motivations for erecting these kinds of structures. She observed that in this time period, saw an intense trend of monument building both in the northern and southern United States as a way to recast social narratives that had developed after the war. Particularly in the South, these public monuments were a response to sweeping changes in the nation's fabric, including national reunification after the Civil War, industrial modernization, growing immigration and social tensions, and rising American nativism, nationalism, and imperialism. Local municipalities, politicians, and pundits feared they were losing power and wanted to use public art as a way to reassert themselves and their region, not in terms of rebellion, but as, quote, vindicated patriots in a reunified America, end quote. These monuments became a way of telling a public story that aligned better with national values. Significantly, Bashir noted that many memorialists also saw the 1893 Chicago Exposition as a significant forum for presenting these new narratives of an idealized and sanitized South through contributing works rooted in classicism that, quote, offered images of a unified, stable, hierarchical Anglo-Saxon nation asserting its place in the world, end quote. In Utah, the Brigham Young Monument was also built and, again, initially presented in Chicago for a similar reason, to counter what were perceived as damaging narratives. Rees observed that the monument works to demonstrate the Americanness and the whiteness of Latter-day Saints at a moment when the church was seeking social and political integration with the rest of the country, trying to counter the institution's images as an outlying quote or a group of radical sexual deviants. While this may seem odd that Mormons would have to prove their whiteness, Motion and Crosby pointed out that in the minds of many 19th century Americans, the practice of polygamy and racialized otherness were closely linked. Thus, many critics of the church characterized members in similar ways to black and indigenous persons. In particular, Rees called attention to comments from Cyrus Dallin, the designer of the monument, that clearly articulate white supremacist discourse. The figure of the native man is the lowest, representing a primitive socio-spatial configuration of the area. The trapper represents the coming of white civilization to the territory, but to a coarser kind of version of it. The pioneer settler represents a developed, more stable version of Western whiteness rooted in agriculture and production, while the cultured figure of Brigham Young represents, quote, the first civilization of the Great West. And that's a quote from Dallin. Thus, the monument ends up being a tool for remythologizing Mormonism that is rooted in the anti-native scheme of civilization being figuratively higher than indigenous ways of being in the world. While Utah did not participate in the Civil War, elites of the time chose to embody their Americanness through calling on scripts of anti-native violence. We can see that there are similarities of purpose, timing, and presentation in these uses of war memorials in the two separate parts of the United States. Let's look really quickly at several elements that can kind of back up my contention that this monument is related to war memorials. A design feature that stands out from the monument is the overwhelming presence of weapons in the figures on the base. The eastward-facing Native American holds his bow out at arm's length with an arrow pouch on his back. The westward-facing trapper on the other side of the monument sits with his musket in his lap and knife on his hip. The south-facing farmer holds a musket in his left hand, while the north-facing plaque lists a cannon among the company's gear. The muskets, the knife, and the bow and arrow, it could easily be argued, were necessary for frontier survival and economic life, for procuring food and pelts. But they were also implements of war and interpersonal violence, so we cannot dismiss them as merely being practical. Furthermore, one could reasonably doubt that a cannon was a necessary piece of gear for a group fleeing west to escape religious persecution. A cannon could not be useful for either hunting or trapping. A successful shot, of course, would obliterate the pelt or food source. Cannons, of course, are specialized tools for making war, for killing people, destroying property, making the landscape generally unusable, etc. On a more symbolic, rhetorical level, of course, a cannon signifies power, sending the message, handle us with care, we can and may destroy you. The very presence of the signifier cannon invokes the discourse of warfare. It is also worth noting that the settlers, with their muskets and cannon, possess superior firepower, so to speak. The implied narrative asserts a kind of victory over the natives. Thus, on a very basic semiotic level, the monument invokes a kind of connection with the discourse of war that we cannot ignore. If we consider the monument in terms of Wolff's logic of elimination of the native, this makes complete sense. The Mormon occupation of the Utah Territory was part of Euro-American westward colonial expansion, even though they would not have been considered agents of the American government at the time. However, this is entirely in keeping with westward expansion throughout the colonial and early republic and even the postbellum years. Dunbar Ortiz showed how over and over again civilian paramilitary and militia groups drove expansion, even when it was illegal, as in the case of English settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains after the French and Indian War. These settlements were against the terms of the 1763 Treaty of Paris, which forbade English westward expansion. The inclusion of a cannon, then, among the equipment of the pioneers demonstrates an anticipation, if not an expectation, of violence, of communal violence. If we consider the time frame in which the pioneers set out west, it seems that this would have been part of the set of expectations that went along with a culture associated or that relies on anti-Indigenous violence. To wrap up, I would like to show a couple slides of Civil War monuments built around the same time as the Brigham Young Monument to show how the Salt Lake Memorial has a kind of generic resemblance to these other monuments. On this first slide, we can see how this cuboid pedestal feature is common to a number of these monuments. Please also notice how many of these figures have this same pose of weight on the right foot with the left foot bent as if to move forward. On this second slide, we see that multiple figures is another common feature of this visual vocabulary. And in this third one, here again, just wanting to call attention to the same kind of pose that we see in the Brigham Young figure. And so this presence of these kind of generic elements, the presence of all the weaponry, the position of the native person under the foot of Brigham Young, these all kind of suggest this kind of victory and this kind of triumphant narrative over Indigenous that was incomplete, was always incomplete, but is nevertheless damaging. To close, I want to point out that this monument still stands. It is a continual reminder of the incomplete removal of native peoples from this place, a reminder of ongoing settler-colonial relationships. It's part of what John P. Hopkins calls the dominant colonial voice that, quote, reflects and perpetuates, unquote, efforts to dictate the absence or qualified or authorized presence of native peoples and to, quote, control native cultural expressions, end quote. Within the church, Indigenous members are telling us that they are still experiencing cultural erasure consistent with settler colonialism. Boxer's essay addresses this. Moroni Benally in a 2017 essay on Mormon settler Indigenous tensions asserted that the church continues to assert itself as a colonizing institution, with many native members telling stories of local leaders bent on defending social structures of the church that are rooted in whiteness and settler colonialism, seemingly at all costs to the detriment of their brothers and sisters. It seems that if we are to work towards a unified Zion society, then we need to eliminate messages like those communicated through the memorial. Those of us who are non-Indigenous members cannot seriously expect our native spiritual siblings to desire unity while we continue to display signs of their elimination, or attempted